Welcome, everybody, to the 20th episode of the ABT Time podcast. And my good friend Matt tells me that there's some recent study that says that most podcasts don't make it past 20 episodes. So this is episode 20, and we are going stronger than ever. And this is going to be a dynamic episode, a special one, where we're going to go for a full hour and a half because we've got two amazing guests that you're going to hear a lot about. This is going to be such an intense session that I've asked my co-host Jen to hold off joining us until we get to the Q&A after the first hour. Then we'll have a half an hour at the end there for everybody to join in and ask questions and have general discussion with them. But I want to dive right in and get started on this. And as you know, with the ABT Time podcast, this is more than just a little chit chat session. This is really a component of our overall narrative gym agenda that we've got, the ABT framework course. And the podcast plays fine if you're not in the course, you don't know the first thing about the ABT framework. But if you do, there's all these extra dimensions that we'll dive into. And as a result, I'm going to give an introduction here. You might as well get comfortable, especially Jeremy and Patty, because the introduction is going to be about 20 minutes. I'm going to go through about a dozen slides, setting everything up. And part of what I'll be doing in the introduction is presenting some of the ABT framework dimensions of why we've got these two guests. So one of the, as you know, over the years, I've written several books about science communication, and they've had a critical edge to them. And as a result, lots of scientists have got annoyed. And one of the things they like to ask me, well, who do you think's a great communicator of science, or in general, great communicators? And the answer is what we've got here today, which is two truly great communicators, senior academicians, and two great minds. That's one way to look at this. You know, a lot of the guests that I brought in here to this podcast, it's a little bit like Dr. Frankenstein in front of the whole medical study group, where I'm presenting these exhibits for everybody to poke and prod and to see. Here's your live demonstration of these are two great brains that have deep narrative intuition, and they understood narrative long before anybody was getting analytical about it, as a lot of people are doing nowadays. And I'm going to talk a little bit about examples from their work to show you that. So here's our two guests, Patty Limerick and Jeremy Jackson, both longtime buddies of mine. Patty was an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz. That's significant, kind of her hippy-dippy past a little bit. She did her PhD in history at Yale University, then became a professor at Harvard. And about that time, I was in graduate school. And I remember seeing in the Harvard Gazette more than once stories about this history professor on campus who was rather entertaining and would get in the news there on campus. And her name was Dr. Limerick. How could you ever forget a name like that? She went on to become a professor. She moved to the University of Colorado, where she was the co-founder of the Center for the American West there, and eventually became a MacArthur Fellow. And then about 2006 or 7, I was sitting looking at my email inbox one day, and honest to goodness, an email popped up from Patricia Limerick, and I looked at that name, and I'd never met her, but I thought that there can only be one Dr. Limerick in the cosmos, and sure enough, it was her. We started talking, and over the last 15 years, we've worked on a bunch of things together, especially right now. She's part of our ABT framework course, and that'll be part of our discussion that we have here today. Jeremy, I have known for a long time, going all the way back to when I was an undergraduate and applied to do a PhD with him, and he very proudly rejected me as a graduate student. He has mentioned that so many times over the years. I think it might be on his permanent resume, his curriculum vitae. Rejected Randy Olson for a PhD program. He seems to be very proud of it. He and I kind of connected from day one, way back then. And over the years, have had a million long discussions about marine ecology and things like that back when I was a scientist. He was one of the people in the science world that understood what I was headed off to do, which was to go off to film school and try and learn some of these tools for broad communication and eventually circle back to the science world. So we kind of parted company in 1994. And then 7 years later, reconnected for our Shifting Baselines campaign that we ran, where I worked with him to try and create some mass media around this term, shifting baselines. That's going to come up in a lot of our discussion today. So what had happened was that I'd gone off and developed these film resources. And in 2001, he and I reconnected. And at that point, he told me about this new term that was originated by fisheries biologist Daniel Pauly in the mid-90s. But really was just sitting there in the fisheries world. And Jeremy was the one who said, don't you think this term has much broader ramifications than just fisheries? That what this is about is losing track of the past. Baselines are reference points from the past. If we start readjusting everything and letting them shift around, we can end up where we don't even know how things used to be. And once you get to that point, how can you ever restore anything? And how can you work for conservation biology and all those sorts of issues? I agreed with him, and he worked with me on an editorial that I submitted to the LA Times. The editors there were so fond of the topic, they rewrote about a third of the editorial, and the result was it was published in November 2002 and has gotten a lot of exposure over the years. Just last year, there was a review paper in Nature on the topic of shifting baselines and coral reefs, and it began by citing that op-ed from way back then. And the term shifting baselines was indeed, I mean, Jeremy was prescient in knowing it was so important and relevant to the future. And it has radiated out beyond the world of conservation biology. In fact, just in this past year, Dave Roberts at Vox and Brian Walsh at Axios have both written articles about shifting baselines in relation to the pandemic and how we've lost track of, how we got to a point where thousands of people were dying in a day and nobody really cared. They got so numb. That's shifting baselines. You lose track of the world that we used to have where nobody died from pandemic. So it's a very powerful and relevant term. We'll be talking about it, and it has to do with history, and that's all the more reason why it's relevant to have Patty be a part of this discussion. So in a few minutes, I'm going to jump back to more background on Jeremy, but first let me continue talking about Patty. And for both of them, they're at a point in their careers now where they can look back at all the different works they've both written, published lots and lots of stuff. And yet when you get to that point, for almost everybody, there's one main work that you did somewhere along the line, which is the one that really stands out at a level above all the rest. And I assume this is the case with Patty. I actually didn't get confirmation from her, but we've talked a lot about her book. Legacy of Conquest is super important book, which even today is still very much one of the most important books in the study of American history. She said that there's even a question on the SAT exams from her book. It was published in 1987. And it was the establishment, it was a paradigm shifting book, basically, establishing her voice. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit of detail in a minute or two, and then she'll give us more specifics on that. And then Jeremy, as I say, great communicators, not just in writing, but also he, of all the scientists that I've known over the years, I think was just about the best speaker in giving talks and presentations. I was lucky enough to spend some time around Stephen Jay Gould in his prime. I thought he was probably the greatest communicator I ever knew, but Jeremy's very close second. And he, from the very beginning of my science career, we go to meetings and his was always the talk that would be overflow crowd. And he has not just a theatrical presence and he's got a means of delivery, but he also has got this narrative brain. And so, you can have all the theatrical presence you want, but if your content ends up being and boring stuff, after a while, people just aren't going to hang in there. So that's the rare combination that he's had, is both presentation skills and an ability to shape the narrative, not just in the presentation, but even in the Q&A, to give answers that are very clear and focused and draw on. And this isn't about storytelling. This is about narrative, that word at the beginning, the narrative intuition, which is more about the problem solution dynamic, knowing how to structure information around that. So when we ran Shifting Baselines, he gave a lot of great talks back then. And I remember sitting there in the audience over and over again thinking, God, I wish I had the resources to film one of these talks and save it for posterity. I never did, but thankfully the TED folks ended up doing a TED event in the Galapagos Islands around 2010. And Jeremy was one of the speakers on the cruise that went down there. And they recorded his talk, and it's got over 1 million views on the TED website. And it's a perfect talk. It captures exactly that voice. You can see why he's been such a popular speaker over the ages. So going back to Patty, about 5 years ago, this is my older brother, Eric. He and I did a visit to the University of Colorado. She had me speak to her history department about the ABT. And unbeknownst to me, she was imprinting on it, picking up everything I had to say. It turns out 3 months later, she gave a big keynote address that opened with a slide with ABT on it. And it was a transformative moment for her. So last year, when she started talking to me about that, I didn't even know that it happened. I invited her to be part of the course. And as soon as she started doing one of the 5 guest presentations in the course, we've gotten deeper into ABT dynamics, and she's developed this whole model of the official fool. That's a whole separate element that's tremendous. And she's now a core part of the course. And she and I are working together now to try and bring ABT framework stuff to her whole discipline of history, and lots of people getting involved there. So that's a bit of her background on that. But also she's a great writer, and she has a blog called Not My First Rodeo that she usually posts on Thursdays, each week, one big post on there. I've read a whole bunch of them. They're all wonderful, but some of them really stand out. And one really great one was last spring, upon the death of the novelist Larry McMurtry. And she had known Larry McMurtry well over the years. And they ended up embodying the two kind of fundamental perspectives on the American West in terms of communicating about it. And so to kind of bring that to life, let me read you a few extracts from that blog post. And not the whole thing, just a little bit at the beginning here, but these are kind of give you a really clear idea. So this was the post, Larry McMurtry, me, and our abject failure to feud. Larry McMurtry wrote Lonesome Dove and lots of other kind of romantic novels of the old American West, the cowboy lifestyle and all those sorts of things that all the people in the West just love. You can see this little caption here, minor regional novelist versus her caption, minor regional historian. We'll get to that in a minute. And here's how she begins this blog post, this quote that she found from Larry McMurtry in 1999 that starts to set up the divide in the two voices you can see very clearly. He wrote, I now think it's likely that a lot of my writing about the cowboy was an attempt to understand my father's essentially tragic take on his own and human experience. He'd attached his heart to a hopeless ideal, a 19th century vision of cowboying and family pastoralism. It was an ideal he himself could never realize, but it had been kept alive, though trivialized and cheapened by the movies and pulp literature. It had even been kept alive by my own writing. What a concession, almost confession, about how he had somewhat trivialized the American West through this romantic picture that he cultivated. So this is where Patty goes on, and what she begins to say is, 30 years ago, shifting public attitudes towards Western American history seemed to call Larry McMurtry and me to see each other as antagonists. We turned out to be unable to accept that call. Back in 1990, we seemed to be willing to give this a try, and we made a couple preliminary moves on public record to arrange ourselves in oppositional categories. Mr. McMurtry was cast as the novelist who complied with the West's and the nation's sentimentalization of cowboys. I was cast as the historian who saw that sentimentalization as a disservice to the West and the nation. So in ABT terms, what it means is the two of them had pretty much divided along those lines. Patty's approach was more and, not in terms of being non-narrative, boring, anything like that, but in terms of what and is that's the language of reality, warts and all. And it's giving you the picture that, doesn't make as good of a story. It's really just the real picture of the old grubby West. Of course, McMurtry was the ABT version. He was telling great epic stories of the spirit out there solving the problems of the West. And you can imagine which of the two of their books ended up making for the great Hollywood movies. Hollywood doesn't want to make the truth and reality of the and of the grubby West. They want to make the romanticized picture. But here's what she goes on to say, which is really great. And then somehow we switch sides. McMurtry took to writing essays that proclaimed the inaccuracy and error of the cowboy myth and consigned ranches and ranchers to a departed Western past. I took to writing essays that called attention to the resilience and persistence of ranches and ranchers, and warned that without ranches, many Western landscapes in the future would lose the beauty of open spaces and a wide horizon. I do not know what Mr. McMurtry thought about this transformation, or if he even noticed it. With his passing a week ago, the task of offering commentary on our failure to feud is left up to me. It would not be very Western of me to try to dodge the strenuous undertaking in historical appraisal and interpretation, but in the usual way of elegy, I'm sad to be doing this by myself. And then she says, one of Larry McMurtry's finest legacies rests on the joy he took in wearing a sweatshirt that identified the wearer as, quote, minor regional novelist. I dream of the moment when I can head out into a post-pandemic world declaring our connection by sporting a counterpart t-shirt identifying me as, quote, minor regional historian. So there's our intro to Patty. Now a few more words on Jeremy. Jumping all the way back to a year after I first met him, I spent the summer of 1978 at the Discovery Bay Marine Lab on the North Shore of Jamaica taking a course in coral reef ecology. And this was the whole class. There were 8 professors in there. That's Jeremy with the glasses, the back, 36-year-old Jeremy Jackson. And this is a super important note to make. And Jeremy, I hope you will soak this in, because what went on that summer in this course, we were out diving all day, every day. We were 2, 3, 4 times a day out there on the reef, coming back in the boats, unloading the tanks, loading up more tanks at the dock. And over again, when we were doing that, Jeremy would be down there giving us little mini lectures as one of the professors and pointing out all the young Jamaican boys that were coming in their boats. And they would have stringers full of fish that were like 3 and 4 inches long. And he would point to those stringers and say to all of us, look at what they're bringing in from the reef. There's no big fish left out there. These reefs have been overfished like all these reefs in the Caribbean. And there's a consequence of that. What you're out there studying every day here with this course, we're having fun studying the physiology and individual fish and things like that. But what we were already studying there was so completely altered in 1978. And he was the one guy singing that song. Nobody else there that summer talked about that. it would take another 20 years for him to really get deeper into formalizing that. And that's what he and I talked yesterday about. What do you think is probably the most important of all the papers he's written? This is not the most prominent. It was published in a kind of second-tier journal, Coral Reefs. But this was the talk that he gave in 1996 at the International Coral Reef Symposium, which is kind of like the Olympics for coral reefs. Every 4 years, all the coral reef people in the world get together and hold this giant meeting. In 96, it was held in Panama at the Smithsonian when Jeremy was there as a scientist, and he was one of the head organizers. And I think this was the opening keynote address that he gave. And this really was kind of the manifesto that was launching an entire branch of ecology, which is historical ecology. This was a paper titled Reefs Since Columbus. And the one thing I want to just point out in here is that this is the circularity of, the reason I've always been a fan of Jeremy's and drawn to listening to his talks and reading his papers is this deep narrative intuition. And he never had a book like the Narrative Gym or any of these ABT manuals that we're putting together nowadays. He just had deep narrative intuition like all the greatest communicators in the past. And here's one place where we can see it. Take a look at this paragraph over here. The first paragraph you can see right there has got the word but towards the end of it. But the second paragraph right there, here's perfect ABT structure. He says ecology is a young science with little reliable descriptive information before the 1920s and virtually no time series population data extending back for more than a century. It's a little bit of hinting at a problem. If we worked with him today in the course, we'd pull that back a bit, be less of stating the problem. But then he ups it with the real problem here. You could drop the word in but right the next sentence and say, but the situation's even worse for marine communities like coral reefs. So what he was saying is that ecology suffers to begin with from not being able to have these long timelines, but it's even worse in the oceans and with coral reefs not having that timeline. And then take a look at the next sentence there. Doesn't start with therefore, starts with the exact same word. Thus, coral reef ecologists have been forced to try to explain. There's perfect ABT structure at the beginning of this paper. That is the embodiment of really a great communicator. So let's see, now I'll skip that bit there. So that is the end of my lengthy introduction here. The last little thing I'm going to do to tee off this discussion and bring on our two wonderful guests is Patty sent me this email yesterday after she read that paper. I sent her the PDF of it. And this is what she just did a backflip over. I'm sorry, the last section of that paper is titled Concluding Remarks. I'm assuming these are actual words that you said to the 1,000 or so participants there at that opening keynote. But the first sentence of this last thing, concluding remarks, Patty just absolutely loved this sentence. I do too. This is hilarious. So look at this sentence. I hope this brief discussion will put to rest two dangerous stupidities, at least within the scientific community. So on that note, let's have our two guests join us. I'm going to take the slides away. Patty and Jeremy. Jeremy is in his car in the coast of Maine. So hopefully we'll have a strong internet connection with him. Greetings, Patty, and greetings, Jeremy. And, Patty, tell me why that sentence struck you.
Well, because envy is the most sincere form of flattery. And when I saw that, I thought, why didn't I write that? Son of a gun, how come I didn't write that? And I guess I don't think of myself as timid or soft-spoken, but I didn't write that. And so I spent a little bit of time in regret of thinking, oh my Lord, that was what I wanted to say, but I didn't realize that was how I wanted to put it. But I'm still alive, so I will be using it. So with attribution, of course, but it's not too late for me to use that. It's just I think I would go way past two is the only problem with that. I would lose.
There are many stupidities.
That phrase, you are so far ahead of your time with that term, dangerous stupidities. I mean, little did you know the next 25 years would be characterized by so many dangerous stupidities. How does that? It's 25 years since you wrote that. What are your thoughts on that term today, Jeremy?
Well, I think it was true, and it was designed for shock value, of course. I mean, the talk did end more or less verbatim like that. It was to about 1,300 people stuck in a room. There were no alternative sessions going on. And after that, there was this deafening silence. I thought, oh my God, I'm in trouble. But as people were just trying to digest it, and as a really fun footnote, back then, 1996 was the meeting. There was no such thing as PowerPoint, so we all made Kodachrome slides, right? which we had to send to a developer and get back. So people were stuck with their original slides. And people told, I mean, I was running that meeting, so I went to maybe 5 talks besides my own in the plenaries. But people came and told me, Jeremy, you won't believe it. People are taking India ink pens and they're crossing out the word pristine in their slides. Then I knew that I had done something that, I mean, just the discomfort was fascinating, you know? And as you know, that was what, I would say it changed my career. My dad was an historian of the Caribbean. So I was pre-adapted.
Tell us more about that. What do you mean by your dad was a historian?
Well, he was a sea captain who, when he married my mother, decided he'd become a professor instead. So he went back to school and got his PhD at Harvard in maritime history under a guy named Bob Aubion and the great evil Samuel Eliot Morrison, and then who truly was a white supremacist and academic guys. But he never lost that touch of being a mariner. And when I was a little boy, he'd actually read to me at bedtime books like The Buccaneers of America by Esquemeling and all this stuff. So I grew up with a kind of deep understanding of the Caribbean, and that there was a history which I know pre-adapted me to stop and ask questions. Because I don't think many historians would deny the great abundance of the buffalo. I mean, they were there, we ate them. But marine ecologists actually thought they were looking at pristine abundances of green turtles, for example, which was patently absurd, but that's how out of touch marine scientists were, because it's such a new science. And we've only been able to be underwater effectively for less than 100 years. So anyway,
let me ask Patty about, so I know you're the co-founder of the Center for the American West, but have you had any experience in the Caribbean in American history?
No, we do specialization. Don't your people do that? Your people do that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a shame. What I have had is what I have so fortunate that I do get out in the world, and I have been on a panel several times with Caribbean historians, learned from them. I'm very absorptive. I'm really, well, not a maritime sponge, but a sponge. So I do take things in with that. I certainly have, we don't, as Western American historians, we all do pay attention to Columbus, since he did get this whole thing screwed up, I guess we could say that, or got it going, or set off, hit the first domino or something like that. So I'm not oblivious, but I am sad to say how terrestrial and continental I have turned out to be.
Well, let me pose
I will interrupt to say the flip side. I've read one great book about the American West, unfortunately not Patty's, but Cadillac Desert, which utterly transformed my understanding of half of the country. And the little bit I read that you sent me of Patty's book, just thinking about, talk about frontiers never ending, just the whole struggle to come to grips with water, which we're now seeing come back to bite us in the ass, is really a fascinating story. And it had a huge effect on me. I think it's fun to step out of our comfort zone.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes. And oh my Lord, what a way of just living in an oxygen-free room to not get out and not move around like that. But I do want to say that I think I love the fact that we should have been smarter, because we certainly knew that there were bison and then there weren't very many. So we did have the advantage that we knew that. And you folks weren't really, I guess you were dredging, not diving. You were doing something that didn't seem quite so effective, but we didn't really end up, for quite a number of years, our chance to be smarter didn't really turn into anything. So we still had a very, my predecessors had a very strong sense that the West was quite endless in its resources. And when one petered out, another resource got discovered, and and came online in some ways. So I don't know that we actually ended up being that the wiser kinds of thinkers that we could have been, because we knew that the bison had been there and weren't. Because I don't think we didn't hang out with ecologists very much, so we did not really know what if you take out a keystone species, what happens to everything else. I don't think we thought in those terms. So
okay, let me impose a template here for a question for both of you, basically, or a major topic that structures what we're talking about here. So yesterday, in the ABT framework course, we had Jeremy's wife, Nancy Knowlton, gave the talk. And one of the key parts of her presentation there was about the whole kind of professional career of Rachel Carson, her whole journey, and mapping that against the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell to some extent, but really more the monomyth template. And what you could see with her life is what I had in my life, which I'm going to ask Jeremy if he had it, and you as well, Patty. But the idea of the monomyth is that a story begins with the ordinary world, an initial stage where there's no drama, no conflict, no problems, no nothing. It's just nirvana. It's wonderful. It's perfect. It's childhood to some extent. It's innocence. And for most of us in my generation who studied the oceans, we were given that for a little stretch there. That summer in 1978, again, we had this harbinger on the dock of Jeremy saying, look at these tiny fish. That's what's coming in your future. But for the rest of us in the course, we were there simply loving the reefs, the science of the coral reefs there, everything like that, complete innocence. It wouldn't be for a few years that we'd start to get these wake-up calls. It actually started 2 years later with Hurricane Allen that beat up those reefs. And then we began to see all through the 80s, all these horrible environmental things. And that was the end of our innocence, that whole early stage there. So let me start with Jeremy on that topic. You must have at some point in your younger years had a blissful stage before you began to encounter the problem. And is there any singular experience moment that you made that transition from just studying these wonderful sea creatures to beginning to realize, wait a second.
Well, you know, I'm writing a book about this right now. It's really interesting. And I started out with my first arrival in Discovery Bay, Jamaica. And
what year?
Meeting these young people who were so fascinating, and meeting this extraordinary man, Tom Grow, who wrote the first ever paper describing in detail the structure and distribution of coral reefs, and being in awe. And I was incredibly lucky. I mean, he gave me a 2-week personal tutorial on the ecology and geology of coral reefs. That was probably better than any 5-year curriculum could have possibly been. And that got me started. And in all that excitement, we never talked about how things had changed, except in geological terms, but we never talked about it in terms of human terms, in spite of the fact that it was obvious there were no fish to eat. You know, I mean, and so I would say, and I was actually a little surprised that you said that I was already talking about the tiny fish in 1978. I guess I was.
Oh yeah, you definitely were.
Yeah, but you know, and the fish pots, and the fact that these guys were so desperate, and so we would even help them get their pots when they were lost, you know, because we had so much empathy for these people working so hard, paddling, not even outboards, out to their pots and pulling them every day. But I will tell you that I never made the connection between the fish and the health of the coral reefs until after the hurricane. And we began to see that it wasn't recovering the way it should. And I started to think really hard, why isn't it recovering the way it should? And then the eureka moment was the realization the problem was us. We had changed the rules of the game, because there had been hurricanes for billions of years, and coral reefs had been growing for 500 million years. Different corals, but growing for 500 million years. And they'd obviously always recovered, or there wouldn't have been any coral reefs. So the big question was why they didn't recover. And it took me about 2 years to figure that out. But, you know, once I did, there was no looking back.
And isn't it wild that if not for Hurricane Allen, those realizations wouldn't have happened as quickly as they did. So everybody knows, the summer of 1980, we were all back there at that lab. It was the most vibrant place in the Caribbean. Everybody studying these happy, healthy, diverse coral reefs. And then all of a sudden that summer, the biggest hurricane of it was like the second biggest of the century, I think, marched right over Jamaica. And we were there. We went through the hurricane and it flattened all the reefs. And the next day, basically, all the scientists that had projects going on there gathered together and said, we got to document this. And they had a paper in Nature a few months later. But it was, or in Science, whatever, it was that one event that instantly woke them all up to, wow, these hurricanes are really important. And isn't that sort of a chance happening to some extent, don't you think?
Yes, I think I mean, a few years later, we would have been aware because a lot of other things were happening. But it really is fascinating. And I think I've told you this, Randy, but the reason I wrote Reefs Since Columbus was because I went to a meeting about coral reefs, health, hazard, and history. And it was stimulated by the wake-up call to global warming and the worries about coral bleaching and whatever. And at that meeting, I sat and listened to everybody. And, you know, my PhD's in geology, so I actually understood that stuff. And I just couldn't stand it that everybody was talking about their beautiful, pristine reefs. So you know, I spoke up and I got battered with virtual rotten tomatoes and rotten eggs. And that's when I went back angry as hell and said, Nancy, I'm going to give a plenary at this damn meeting. And that was the birth of Reefs Since Columbus, because I just couldn't believe that people were so blind, you know, and especially the Australians who said, well, maybe the Caribbean is great.
But, you know, hang on a second. We're in a while, Jen is going to join us and we're going to beat her up over that, her fellow countrymen.
Well, you know, it was
exactly. Let's Patty, how about if you pick up on that? First off, that same question, did you have an ordinary world experience? Did you have some early years that were innocent and thinking that the West was just this happy, fun place? And then were there single events that woke you up?
Well, I am a Western American historian, and that's to say that maybe I can get information from archaeologists and Indian people's stories, but really I'm good for like 4 or 5 centuries. I'm not, sorry, kind of limited in that. So I feel that I never got to, it was so interesting listening to that. I don't know that I was ever given an episode of innocence, because I grew up in Banning, California, on the edge of the desert in Southern California, and sitting on our porch, we would watch wildfires, forest fires on Mount San Jacinto. Sitting, some distance from my porch, there was an Indian reservation, and there were conquered people, and there were people who were with us through elementary school and maybe junior high, and then those Indian people, often it just wasn't working in the school systems for them. So I mean, I just look at that and I think, well, when was my innocence period? I knew that there wasn't that I knew we were in a dry area right on the edge of the desert, and my parents introduced me to an old man named Bert Jost, and it didn't totally make sense to me, but they told me Bert Jost brought us water. I thought, Bert Jost brought us, I have a kid, what, he brought us water. Since then, I have read a wonderful stories, a collection of stories from an Indian woman on the reservation next to my hometown, who has one story is called How the White Man Stole Our Water. So, okay, so there I was in a situation where how come I didn't get to have an innocent?
Wait, let me put the pieces. So Bert Jost was stealing their water and bringing it to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
okay, all right. Just getting clear on that.
A tiny little story. Mark Reisner would not have found this interesting enough to put in there, but yeah, we have our tiny little Banning, California story. So I just cannot see. I lived in a town really close to 15 miles from Palm Springs. That is not ecologically healthy. Palm Springs golf courses in Palm Springs. I mean, so I just am really I never realized how. Well, maybe I did a little bit, that when I went to graduate school and we were reading the books by the reigning Western American historians, not reigning, R-E-I-G-I-N-G, I should say that, but anyway, by those historians, I thought something is wrong here. Or something was wrong with my town. That's what I thought. I read the Western American historians, and they have a kind of completed, the frontier has been closed and the West has been conquered. And I'm thinking, something wrong with my hometown. It's very bad. Our town was not good the way these other stories are. So it took me a while to say, our town was fun. Our town was a reminder of complexity and tragedy and injury and loss and wildfires and all of that. So what happened to those older Western historians, I don't know, but it was really my great pleasure and privilege in life to say, quit that nonsense about a completed end of the frontier and a conquest of nature. And so I just, don't be telling me that when I mean, Mount San Jacinto was really, really close to, we were in the San Gorgonio Pass. So a forest fire there in the 1950s wasn't, anywhere near as common as they've been in the last few years, but I never got a chance to be, I guess it's complacent. Maybe I was innocent because I was a kid. So maybe I was kind of innocent, but complacent, no, never got to do that.
Okay. All right. So this is great. So my little thesis is coming together here. So you just heard Jeremy tell about where that Reefs Since Columbus paper came from, which was that he went away hurt from that meeting and said, F you guys, I'm going to write this thing, give this as a keynote. Did Legacy of Conquest have any of that dynamic to it as well, which is, I'm going to show you people with this whole book to lay it all out?
Sure, it absolutely. That's why I'm so sad that I didn't have the phrase putting to rest dangerous stupidities. That's why I had a little face talking to reporters where
I'm going to name this episode, by the way, with that. That's going to be the title of it. So,
it was kind of I don't think it worked very well and I stopped doing it. But in interviews in the late 1980s with reporters, I would sometimes use the word idiocy. And I don't think that was anywhere near as good as dangerous stupidity. So, but it did finally just build up where I thought, what on earth, why do these established figures get prestige and stature from writing something that really did seem pretty close to nonsense to me, and so denying of everything that struck me as part of the American West? So that
was there a single event you were at where you heard somebody giving a blowhard talk or you read a book or anything like that that catalyzed your writing?
I think I muttered and fumed and felt that there must be something wrong with me for quite a while. So the book Westward Expansion was the kind of reigning book by a man named Ray Allen Billington, sort of the textbook. The chapter on Indians was called The Indian Barrier. That helps, huh? The chapter on the Spanish and Mexicans was called The Spanish Barrier. So Westward Expansion. So I would say that when I finally got to, this is very weird to give such credit, but when I was on the job market and I was interviewed by 3 very prominent Harvard historians, none of whom, well, they hadn't had a Western American historian in 23 years there. So they interviewed me for the job, which I did not think I was going to get for good reason. I thought that, I did get it. But they said, how would you teach a Western American history class that would be different? And so fortunately, I never actually tried to do this, but I just said, well, I would totally reverse the emphasis. I'd completely reverse what is at center stage. It would not be the westward movement of white people. It would be the prior presence of Indian people. It would be the French Canadians coming from the north. It would be the Russians coming from the east. It would be Asian immigrants. It would be the Mexicans, Spanish people coming north. It would be a bunch of actual historically verified movements of people that were.
Okay. Oh, wait, hang on one second. It's time for an ABT moment. A break from our sponsor, to hear a word from our sponsors. This is Jerry Graff's book that I'm constantly talking about, and I'm always, bashing you about it. But what you've just said right there is straight out his title. They say, I say, and that's what you're saying. Is that was your ABT dynamic, which was, you said they say for generations, this is what they've said, but here's what I say. And that's where your legacy book was exactly that, wasn't it? That was the ABT. That's why that book endures. The voice of it is so clear like that, right?
That's right. And I think I would love, maybe we could do this in the next maybe 5 or 6 minutes. We could figure out what was the formula or the sequence or the process that sent Jeremy in to give his talk to say, get over those dangerous stupidities. And what was the comparable process or formula or dynamic that got me to say, okay, I am not tenured, but I'm going to write a book that says, let's give the West its proper meaning. So is it biochemist? Are there neurologists who could help us figure that out? Because if we could just have more people doing that, and maybe it's just Emperor's New Clothes, maybe that's all it is, but it's.
Well, okay, towards that end, let's, if we were to have a gauge of acceptance from 0 to 100 of the legacy book, the message of your book, where did it start out at? How has it gone over the years? Did it level off? Tell us what that graph would look like.
It would look like the stock market in 1929 at the very start, just going to. The poor thing, the book came out in the fall of 1987. My editor at W.W. Norton in New York, he saw the advanced copy of the New York Times Book Review. He called me and he said, well, Patty, I think your next book's going to do better. Because the first review in the New York Times Book Review was just boring. It didn't actually do much to convey the book and so on. So then we had like 2 months after that, not long after that, I got to organize a big conference funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. I just had wandered into that, and it was called Trails Towards a New Western History. And I used that conference to reflect on the changing field of Western American history. Washington Post covered it, New York Times covered it, and then I could go to conventions of historians and they'd go, well, you're doing pretty well. I saw you in the Times Magazine. I think, yes, I am doing pretty well. Yes, I am. And
Love it.
so by 1988, it had gotten a lot of press coverage, and the sales started in, and the sales continue to this day. So, and then what was so ridiculous, and I'm still a little bit, I don't know, it'll be so interesting because Jeremy's temperament and personality seems very interesting. I actually was shocked and sad at how rapidly I became the establishment, which was certainly not my vision. I was such an excellent young rebel. I was really good. And then in maybe 5 years, I had become the major interpreter of the American West. And I had to be very careful because young people could be very fragile. If I spoke honestly about their work, I couldn't do that. So it was very interesting to go so quickly. What was I always used to say? I was a really, really good young Turk, and then I instantly became an old bird.
And Jeremy, have you ever been at risk of being part of the establishment?
No, I don't know how to put that. I think that's really interesting. Reefs Since Columbus struck a chord with a lot of people, but certainly not the establishment of marine ecology. And, the follow-up, the historical overfishing. So I guess I should say,
let's say a few words about that. So that paper came out from your talk.
Reefs Since Columbus. I moved from the Smithsonian in Panama to the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. I realized that Reefs Since Columbus was important, and I wanted to pursue it. And so I organized a big group of people through something called the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. And they gave me $250,000 to convene about 20 people to just really dig into the history of change in marine ecosystems. And I would say that in the process, we actually created a new field of sort of being able to be scientifically rigorous about reconstructing the past, to have a sense of change. And so the first paper we published, the one that you jumped in on to do shifting baselines with me, was called Historical Overfishing and the Recent Collapse of Coastal Ecosystems. And of course, the message of the paper was, everybody thinks that what's going on is today's news with no sense whatsoever of the past. Well, I stepped on a lot of toes in that paper. I called it as it was about the collapse of cod, which was, I basically said the entire field of fisheries science is bogus and a scam, because these people had been getting full professorships and huge grants of money to oversee the collapse of virtually every fish stock in America. So boy, I got a lot of pushback and crap. And I gave a talk in Nova Scotia where those people who had approved the cod catch literally stomped out of the room as loudly as they could. And I had an encounter with the infamous Ray Hilborn, who told me that everything I had written in my paper was common knowledge in fisheries science, at which point I replied and said, well then, Professor Hilborn, why didn't you do something about it? The emperor had no clothes, but the emperor fought back really hard. And there was a Hate Jeremy Jackson blog. There was actually a website dedicated to hating me. I'm sort of proud of that. I didn't have any death threats, but I did, for a number of years. And so it became a war for opinion, that because it was about a national security issue, food for people to eat, actually went to the National Academy, and there was a NRC committee dedicated to evaluating whether my paper and the paper of the great Daniel Pauly, Fishing Down the Food Web, and Ram Myers says 90% of all the big fish are gone. They set up a whole National Research Council study that was sort of aimed at shooting us down. And then in the end, they had to give us the good housekeeping seal of approval. And they said, well, maybe not 90% of all the big fish are gone. Maybe it's 78%, you know, and stupid stuff like that. But I would say it was a battle of 10 years to actually get it to the point where everybody now admits that fisheries are a mess.
So,
and I will even say with a little pride that as a result of that, the National Marine Fisheries Service is doing a great job of trying to improve it.
so I'm a little bit sad that I made it seem like everyone just loved me, because they didn't. And now I just want to make it clear that I was shouted at, and people walked down on me, and people condemned me. I never had a site, to the best of my knowledge. I guess it was too early to have such a site existence. We didn't have an internet.
Right, you beat me to it.
That's where I really jumped ahead there in a very wise way. But some of the older people were very angry. And one of them in particular was well, there were a bunch of them were angry. One of them wrote an article referring to the new Western history, my stuff, as Stalinist, fascist, and deconstructionist. Which, if you think that...
Interesting combination.
It's very, very hard to do all those at once. So I did have furious people. I had some furious popular columnists and so on. I don't recall anything that was actually disturbing. The people who were see, that's the advantage I had over you. The old guys who were very outraged were so over the top that they actually discredited themselves. So all I had to do was just kind of hold still. And then within a year or two at the Western History Association meetings, those people, when they would walk around the book display area, the ones who had really gone mad, no one wanted to talk to them. They were really on their own. And people would come up to me and would say, well, Patty, I've never really agreed with much of what you've done, but what so-and-so said about you was terrible, and what so-and-so said was terrible. So I actually, maybe being a girl has an advantage. Maybe that's the advantage, that they were, oh, you shouldn't be treating a lady like that. I don't actually think that was much at work there, but because in fact, I think they were more surprised and astonished that a female would come charging in. I always thought that watching National Geographic shows on wolf packs, I could see how I had been really lucky, because if a young male wolf challenges the senior wolves, there's a whole method for dealing with that. But a young female wolf would never go in and challenge. I mean, why would a young female wolf go in and challenge the old wolves? So I think there was actually more confusion. And what on earth are we supposed to? She's supposed to be a women's historian. Why doesn't she go over there and just write about women? That would be very satisfactory. She could do that. So when I was in the main arena, I think there was a real, what are we supposed to do about that? Our mothers wouldn't like us. If our mothers raised us to be sort of supposed to be a little bit gracious with girls, so what are we supposed to do now? So I think it actually worked a little bit in my favor.
Tell us about the accusation that gets leveled at you, the quote insult that Patty Limerick, that revisionist historian.
Well, there you are. Okay, so that is so weird. The word revisionist. When I was a girl in graduate school, we were there was a group of people who I think called themselves revisionists. They worked on foreign policy. There were 4 or 5 of them, and they were very determined to revise. Well, Vietnam War was winding down, but these were people who were really trying to get a better understanding of U.S. foreign policy, and they did call themselves revisionist historians because they were revising a very set piece about post-World War II America. Well, anyway, so that word just, they were kind of left-wing people, so it became synonym for left-wing historian who is not saying comfortable things to us and therefore should be discredited. So as I would just as soon have that phrase go away, because we don't actually say a revisionist chemist. We just think this is a chemist who kept researching. I know that science can be just as maybe, because you have more money, it might be more vicious in some of the fights. We don't have very much money in the humanities, so we don't have quite as bitter a set of battles, I guess. But revisionist just means you're still thinking. I mean, we are all revisionist crossers of streets at busy intersections. We all start to step into the street and then we think, oh, good heavens, there's a car coming. Then we step back. If we were not revisionist pedestrians, we would just walk into the path of the car, because we're always taking in new information and thinking, oh, my Lord, I thought there wasn't any traffic, but now back on the curb. So I'm very tired of the word revisionist applied to historians, when anybody who has not sold their soul or lost neuron effectiveness is thinking all the time, taking stuff in and thinking, what are we doing here? So yes, I guess I have had it with being called a revisionist historian, because it's like,
that's a very, very interesting point, because science prides itself on being, quote, self-correcting. And I've been working with some epidemiologists about that, trying to explain right now what's going on with our knowledge for the pandemic. And when you search self-correcting in science, you find just pages and pages of essays over the years. Everybody, that's the same basic thing. And yet, you're right, revisionism is seen as, well, because of the politics that go with it. I guess that's a much more pernicious word.
Right. Right. So, I mean, there doesn't seem to be any hope. There's, I don't know what, 43 words in English that I would like to just go away. And I have had no impact making them go away. They just keep hanging around. So, and some of them are academic jargon in the present: intersectionality, neoliberal. I mean, there's some words that are left-wing words that I just think, oh, please spare us those.
Well, let me toss out one little anecdote that brings to life a term. The term is restoration. Where I live here, there was a local environmental project about 10 years ago that was a lagoon, in which the flow in the lagoon had gotten really bad. There were big regions that had no flow. It was really anoxic. And so the state parks or whatever came in, and they had a big project to dig it out and restructure the flow. Well, it quickly turned into a battle over what was healthy for this little lagoon thing. And people began reaching back for pictures from the 1920s and trying to argue, this is how it used to be, this is what it was, blah, blah, blah. I eventually came in and said to them, why did you even bring the word restoration up? Restoration starts to point to the past, for which you don't even know what the past is. Why don't you just call it the rejuvenation or revivification or something like that? But tell me your thoughts, both of you, on this word restoration. First off, Jeremy, in the ecological context, you come across the word restoration, and what in the heck does it mean?
Well, sure, people talk about it all the time. I mean, the way something was in the past, more or less. It's not the way it used to be.
But you think you know what it was. That's the whole shifting baselines problem, right?
Yeah, but I mean, even in the short term. So, I mean, there's some clear examples where the term has meaning. One that Nancy likes to talk about all the time is Tampa Bay, which became a big sewer, unlike your little lagoon. Right. And it was sort of obvious why. It was because they were dumping all the sewage of Tampa and St. Petersburg into that bay. And they said, well, this is really stinky and bad. And they stopped. And they cleaned it up, and they did, quote unquote, restore the seagrass meadows of Tampa Bay to a level that were virtually identical to the way they had been 50 years before. So in some sense, the term restoration has validity if you're informed of the way it used to be. But it's also true, as Tom Wolfe wrote, that you can't go home again. So even if you know exactly the way something was, and you've seen it change, and you want to fix it, you're trying to fix it in a world which is different than it was in the quote unquote beginning. And so as really good ecologists and ecosystem scientists struggle with this, they talk about, you think of it as a multiple space, and good is sort of a certain set of conditions, and bad is another set of conditions. And you're never going to go back to exactly the way it was, but your goal is to, quote unquote, restore the system to a set of conditions which is desirable rather than undesirable. Of course, that's not the way a lot of the conversation goes, where you get people insisting on something being exactly the way it was. And that's nonsense. But you're putting your finger on a very loaded subject in the environment today, because there are a lot of very good people confronting stuff that's obviously bad, in quotes, and trying to think constructively and wisely about how to move away from that. And so there is now a whole science and vocabulary that encompasses the idea of restoration, but in a more grown-up and wiser way, you know?
And Patty, how about your thoughts on the word restoration?
Sure, I have one of those terrible problems in life that I actually am the editor of a collection of essays from University of Colorado people, scientists, social scientists, and humanists on restoration. So I wrote the introduction and the conclusion. So now we're in a terrible mess because I have mess.
This is fun.
So it was like 17 years ago. So there is water under the bridge, so to speak. So I thought, it never occurred to me till I was writing that essay that there are all of these quite remarkable objections to restoration, some of which are what Jeremy's been talking about, that how are we going to be sure what it is? How do we pick the era that we want to restore? And of course, I hang out with National Park Service people, and they have that 1916 law that says, preserve and maintain in an unimpaired condition the lands. Oh, good Lord, an unimpaired condition. Oh my Lord, what a thing. So some people, some federal agencies are really stuck with this. What is it that we had that we should try to recreate, and how in heaven's name is climate change going to fit in that? What is the poor little pika supposed to do in Rocky Mountain National Park? Are we to freeze the pika? Well, not freeze, well, anyway, we're keep the pika in an ecosystem that we think is the pika's ecosystem when it's trying to get up to a cooler latitude. Anyway, so I'm quite steeped in all that. And it never occurred to me that there would be people, maybe they are taking a long nap, but there were people who said that they did not support and could not support restoration because it gave a license for people to disturb and disrupt and pollute and contaminate. I thought, help me with this. Really? Do you really think that restoring, cleaning up a mess is going to empower and give license to the people who want to make the next mess? But I guess at a certain level of jumpiness, because there are reasons to be jumpy about people making messes, I can see that part. But it just was amazing to me, the spectrum of opinions of saying, don't try to fix that. Don't try to do that. That's going to encourage the contaminators and polluters. So, but then there's the whole nostalgia issue, which I just have to say is quite the historian's bane, that the dream, that the way it was.
Let me interject a little divide here, what you were just talking about there, because I actually mentioned this in my Houston book. The National Park Service folks had pointed this out to me, that 1916 statement on the National Park Service about maintaining things in their unimpaired state, that's pure ABT. That's telling a good arc plot story, which is we're going to take care of this thing and it's all going to have a happy ending. Climate change is not. Climate change is more and, which is we're making this up as we go along. And as the climate changes, we're going to do the best that we can. And the Park Service in 2012 did focus groups where they looked into changing their mission statement, trying to update it with climate language. And what they found, the groups just, didn't like it. That's narrative at work. That's where people.
I'm going to interrupt. That's really interesting because I was invited to give a keynote to the gathering of all the leaders of the national parks. And what I was asked to talk about was climate change and migration of animals and plants that they were wrestling with. And so I talked about how in the ocean, there are no barriers and it's going on. And of course, it's going on in land as well. And it was one of the brightest and most interesting groups of people I've ever spoken to. They were really together and aware and all the rest of it. And I was only there for 3 days, but they did talk about being hampered by legal structures. And of course, God came down and touched them on the shoulder and said, this is the way it's supposed to be. And unfortunately, a lot of those people are rich or powerful or, whatever. And so God helped them trying to do this, because even the idea of, take Yellowstone, other than the fact that it might blow up any day, and what is the ecosystem of Yellowstone? Well, where's that going to be in 50 years? It's going to be somewhere on the Canadian border. And I think there's going to be, I think we will come to grips with this. I think that.
Well, it's you're hitting on the intersection.
So obvious,
Well, but you're hitting right there at the intersection between science and narrative. That's the problem, is the science tells us one set of outcomes, but people want to be told a certain story and their brains are programmed to that story. And that's what happened was the Park Service said, we're not going to fiddle with the mission statement. Everybody still loves the old arc plot story of 1916. They've stuck with that. And on that note, we got about a half an hour remaining now. So let's jump into some questions. Matt, do you want to moderate a few questions we've had typed in and see if we can address some of those?
Had one earlier on from Martin. Martin asks, in case this theme isn't reprised in the conversation, please talk more about the concept of the official fool. He goes on to note that I'll note that clowns have won elections in Iceland and Italy, and possibly other countries starting with I. I imagine elected fool and official fool are two different things.
Well, let me, Patty, can I first address that, because it's a functional thing in our course, which is, this is an idea she's worked on for 40 years or so, about the role of fools in society, meaning the court jester, the person who's got special dispensation to ask the obvious questions that nobody else can ask. And she's worked it for 30 or 40 years. In our course, we've actually found an analytical role of that with our working circles, where the fool, as we define it, the official fool, is someone who knows the basic rules of narrative structure, but doesn't know your content, and comes into your group that's working on stuff, knows nothing about the material you're working on, only how to structure it as a good story that they can make sense of, and they won't let you go any further until they can understand it. And we designate that as, quote, the official fool. So it's a little bit different context than what you'd asked that question. Patty, you want to add some more to that?
I do. So I was very frightened to be at graduate school at Yale when I was young. And one thing led to another, and I happened into a clown group on fools, and that gave me offering me opportunity or something to do in the summer besides not write my dissertation. So I joined this fools group, and then one thing led to another. I applied to be the official Yale fool, and the president, fool or jester, I said, the president of Yale, Bart Giamatti, was actually a Renaissance literature scholar, and so he said, taking the word jester rather than the word fool as his preferred word, he wrote me back and said that he couldn't appoint me the official jester because he occupied that role himself. He was both president and jester, and he would not give up the role that gave him the greater satisfaction. So that was a little bit of a setback. So the story goes on and on and on, but I thought I was really jeopardizing. I guess I don't, what did I think? There I am, no finished dissertation, not going nowhere academically, but I still came out in clown makeup with colorful clothing. As you can see, I'm still keeping that up to date. Oh, just a second. I happen to have this right here, just handy right here. So then I went out in various forms of not conventional clothing for Yale graduate students. So out of that came just an incredibly wonderful set of adventures. And they were very satisfying for me. Every once in a while, they were encouraging to others, but not very much. I mean, they just thought, well, that was odd. We were chatting with a fool. Then they went on. So it was really Randy who, in a conversation a few months ago, just thought, we got to do something with that. So Randy, who is quite forceful in lots of ways, he
here it comes.
Really nice little video about the Fools Project and how it could be useful to humanity, which I really had never had that much of. I mean, I thought it could be useful for humanity, but I never had an occasion to say, and this is how. So Randy directed me. Directing me is not the easiest thing in the world. We'll just say that I'm a little bit independent in my own way, a little maverick. So he caused me to put on permanent record a statement about how valuable fools are. And the contrast, I think was Martin was asking about, there are lots of fools in the world, and lots of them are not out in public wearing funny hats and colorful clothes and so on. They are actually pretending to be officials. They're pretending to be elected figures, and they do an enormous amount of damage because they are fools, but they are not. They're small f fools, and they're closeted. So those people, everyday fools, very dangerous, and we must be on alert to them. But official open air, happy, hi, here I am. What did you just say? I couldn't understand you. Could you help me explain? So we don't, jargon is very hard on an official fool, and complicated, oh dear me, we don't do so well with equations and formulas, but we can have them explained to us. So fools are extremely useful, but I'm not sure that I ever really came near that sense of how it could be helpful in the world besides being fun for me. until Randy was the one who saw how it could fit in the ABT. So,
and we really have formalized it in this course in the past year and a half, to the point where our functional unit is the working circle of 5 individuals. And over again, we find that, for example, if you have 4 scientists and you throw in there a quote fool, meaning somebody from the communications world who's brave enough to get in there and say to them, I'm not going to let this group go forward until we get these 3 elements down of narrative structure, the model that we've got, starting off with identifying the problem. And you get people all speaking the same language, and they all think that they're talking crystal clear because they're all in that milieu. But that stranger that you bring in, which we've labeled the fool, but that's really what the dynamic is about. And the more we've worked with it, the more powerful we see that is. And that ends up being at the heart of diversity and ways to cross different cultural barriers and things like that, is an openness, rather than ridiculing the person who doesn't know the content of your topic. For example, one of my experiences was I did a workshop with a bunch of diplomats at the State Department, and they sent me the written evaluations, 15 people, and 14 loved it, but 1 person ripped it to shreds. Why did you bring this scientist in here to talk to us? He didn't know the first thing about being a diplomat. Well, I wasn't there to work on them being diplomats, but that person couldn't get beyond the idea of content. They felt that all communication was just about content. So that's what this is. The fool is about the form element, being able to work that. Yeah. Patty, are you saying something? Oh, Matt, how about next question?
Yeah, next question is from Marlis. As young, independently thinking professionals, Dr. Limerick and Dr. Jackson were brave enough and foolish enough to offer their unique outside-the-box perspectives, but elicited a vicious response by more senior professional establishment. Looking back at their younger selves, what advice would they have for young scientists willing to explore unique, non-conventional ideas?
you go first, Jeremy.
Okay, well, actually, I would say it's not as bad as it used to be. I mean, it should be pointed out that when I wrote Reefs Since Columbus, I was a senior scientist with, whoop-de-doo-de-doo. And when I wrote the other one, the big one that really upset all the fisheries people, I was a chaired professor. I could care less what they thought. But it's commonly thought among young people that they can't speak out, they can't do controversial things, they can't write books like Patty's or whatever. And I did some stuff when I was young, but that's really changed. And actually, back when I was still a professor, I hired a guy whose name is Enrique Salo, who's now very famous, who got tenure, reached full professor faster than anybody, I think, in the history of Scripps. And he did it by just breaking all the rules and being totally dedicated to conservation and not worrying about what anybody said. He was just really good, really, really good. And everybody recognized it. And so I think you have to follow your nose and you have to do what you think. And if you really believe in something and you believe in your heart of hearts that this is what you should be doing, you just have to do it. And if there's risk involved, screw it.
Okay, I'm going to interject a couple comments here. First off, in a few minutes, we're going to bring in our Australian buddy, Jen, and she's going to regret it because she's going to have to answer for her fellow countryman, Jeremy, and the fishery and the fisheries issue from way back when. Matt was concerned whether Jen gets to join the discussion. But the second thing I want to say, another one of these commonalities I'm realizing with the 2 speakers that we have here that I've known for a long time, both of them over the ages connect incredibly well with young people. And that's one of the hallmarks of both of their whole careers as professors. You always hear all these young people that just really connect with what Jeremy and Nancy established their whole Center for Biodiversity and whatever it was there at Scripps. There was all young people there. And Patty has already introduced me to a whole bunch of young historians that are incredible. And when I listen to their opinions, so that characterizes both of them. I think it's their innovative thinking. So Patty, you had a few words on that for young people?
I was totally intoxicated with the idea that universities were places of free and open expression. I went to Santa Cruz. I had very eccentric professors. I just thought, oh, lucky me. I have landed in a territory. It's not Oz, but it's pretty close to Oz or Shangri-La or something. And I get to just be who I am. And I can wear colorful clothes and put funny hats on. And how lucky. And it wasn't until really kind of far down the road when I thought, wait, this is an incredibly conformist operation. Good heavens. The phrase my people use, I think maybe more in the humanities, I hope not so much in the sciences, well, so-and-so wouldn't be a good fit with us. So I feel.
Oh yeah, it happens.
I bet.
It totally happens in all fields.
Right. So this wonderful program, the Mellon Foundation, has let me have a program in applied history, helping young people develop some of the skills to reach wider audiences that have meant so much to me. And I hesitate on this question comes up. How much should I say? Do it. You're a graduate student, but just do it. Then we have very frank discussions about how the job market is very constrained as it is. I would be so miserable if I encouraged a young person to do something that really did them in. And I don't have enough trust in older historians yet to say, do it, it'll be fine. So I think 2 days ago, I was having this conversation with a really gifted young man. So I worry about that because, and especially just the whole thing I have to say, everyone has to say, it'll take you this number of years, 6 or 7 or 8 years to get your PhD. Then if you do get an academic job, then that's 7 years to tenure, then you're on your own, then you can do stuff. So that's like, for 15 years, you're going to be quiet and then you're going to remember what it was you wanted to say. So I live at low level of, I'm not sure if it's despair or panic over this. I try to find ways in which I can give them cover. That's the term I'm starting to use. You want to co-author with me? I can give you cover. I hope I can. I don't.
Okay, let's on that note, Jen, are you still there? How about if you join us? And Jeremy has a tale to tell you about your fellow country.
You probably heard me say.
Yeah, hang on. I've already been clear. I can't take responsibility for all Australians, so
No, but that's
a tough ask.
This is really a great story because he was telling me about yesterday, 1996 at the Coral Reef Symposium, and I knew this well because I lived in Australia and all through the 1980s, and the Great Barrier Reef, as we were hearing the stories of calamities in the Caribbean. Great Barrier Reef was just beyond, any sort of.
So
take it away, Jeremy.
Yeah, well, a very important thing is Australians are very proud of the Great Barrier Reef in a way that nobody is, quote unquote, proud of the Caribbean. And it's really interesting. Every time I've ever been there, it's just always striking to me how aware people are of the reef. I mean, how many Americans are aware of a coral reef, I mean, so it's an aspect of identity and it's really important. And my funny little story aside, you can see with the ongoing worries about the Great Barrier Reef, now that it's out in the open, how many problems there are. It's really interesting to see the intensity with which Australian citizens engage in the story of the Great Barrier Reef compared to what you might see in our country. And, so I think it was a lot of bravura. It was sort of stupid and it was blind eye, but
that said, say a few words of praise for the entire Ames program over a few decades, the systematic way in which they managed to document their reef better than any other reef in the entire planet.
Oh, well, back in the 1960s, when I went to Jamaica, we were it. And Australians came to Jamaica to see what people were doing at the Discovery Bay Marine Lab. And I could give you a list of well-known people as ancient as I am who did that. Nowadays, Australia is it. Australia is the epicenter of coral reef research globally. And it continues to be the center of extraordinary productivity.
And a lot of that is what I got to see in the 1980s, which was they took this systematic approach to looking at this whole resource, whereas you look at the Caribbean, it's just been tragically piecemeal.
Yeah, well, there are 31 nations in the Caribbean.
Well, yeah, exactly. But there was a big nation up above the Caribbean that could have taken some systematic approach to it.
Actually, yeah. I did. I mean, we don't want to get too much into this, but I did direct a huge study on the changes on Caribbean reefs in the last 50 years. And with the exception of Jamaica, which has a huge problem of poverty, where were the worst coral reefs in the Caribbean? They were in the US Virgin Islands and the Florida Keys. So we have egg on our face in a really, really big way. And we still don't get it, you know?
Exactly. Jen, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I absolutely, not directly related to that, although I would say that, you know, a lot of Australian biologists at the moment are pretty seriously miserable at the government that they're labouring under, and the alerts that they've been putting out for decades now about the way we're losing the Great Barrier Reef, and it's just falling on deaf ears. So I think there's a lot of egg on a lot of faces here too. But look, listening to you both, what a pleasure. What I'm interested in is if you had one thing that you could ensure that with the click of a finger, all young researchers in your respective fields understood about your fields, what would it be? One thing that just immediately they all got about the past and where your fields have come from. Because it strikes me that, you know, young researchers are labouring under really, really challenging circumstances right now. I don't know so much about the US situation, but here, you know, there's no money, there's no security in jobs. The workloads are insane. You know, it's really hard for people to engage deeply on their field of interest. So what is it that you wish people in your fields, younger researchers, understood?
The one thing, not 25.
Yeah, one thing. Easy question, I know.
I'm going to try to loop that in with the question from Rick about the bringing the humanities and sciences together, because I did not hang out with ecologists. When I was at Yale, I don't know that I met a neuroscience person, but it was very, very limited, my hanging out and fraternizing. Frank Hutchinson was my neighbor on who was at Yale in the sciences, not the great Hutchinson, but just to drop that name. Anyway, I did have one acquaintance in biology, but that was really sad. That is so not my life now. For the last 20, 25 years, when there is nothing in environmental history that I would ever go near without a science pal. So having a pal who you can just say, let's talk about hydrographs or whatever it is that that is not my language. I just think that has been really, really important. So I'm going to actually say that once you have that, once you realize that you do not need to become the expert on everything, but you certainly need to have people who know things, who you trust and can rely on, and the crossing of the science humanities boundary is a huge part of that. Then, this is the ABT tribute, then before you get very far down the road of your research, work to get your ideas into Randy's ABT thing. And I'm saying this because I've been doing it through the Mellon Project with the academic folks who are going to do applied history, and the upsurge in confidence, not goofy confidence, not overconfidence, that comes when a young person takes all of this blizzard of research they've been doing and they get it into an ABT. This is not, Randy, just, you can go away because I'm just going to say this and you're nowhere to be seen. It may be easier to say it when you're nowhere to be seen, but it is just amazing how that just a person who's just kind of, I'm a little bit, I don't really know what to do with this dissertation. I'm a little bit confused about this. They get an ABT and there is just a visible upsurge in a sense of, I've got something to say. So those two things, get pals and fields of expertise that you don't have to go get a degree in, but
well, let me just toss in one comment there. All your enthusiasm in the world of history, all the enthusiasm of people in the business world I'm working with now, and then I go back to the science world, and what you mostly get there is, well, I don't know if that's exactly the right way to do it. So that's what we're destined to do is the science
yeah,
world.
but
Forever negating.
Don't, Randy Olson, don't get on your anti-science kick. I mean,
Good.
You know, I mean, yes. when Nancy started, because she started it, not me, the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation, I created that class in which I brought you in to teach communication. It was because we felt just what Patty said, that, and you know, that summer course I created, there were PhDs in the history department, in philosophy, in oceanography and biology and whatever, but all of those people we brought together. And the reason we did that was to give them a sense of a common vocabulary, to understand that when people in one field used a word, it didn't mean the same thing as when people in another field used the same word. And if I look at the success of those people, which has been extraordinary, including the people at the, you know, the master's level, not just the the PhDs, I would argue very strongly that a big part of that success was that multidisciplinarity and comfort going to somebody and saying, you know, I don't know a lot about this. Can you explain and help me out?
Yeah, well,
and you
we've
know,
got a lot more to do on that. And Peter Griffith, are you there? Peter, do you want to jump in and activate your microphone or your camera? Peter is old buddy from the coral reef world. Matt, do we see Peter anywhere?
I see Peter. I just enabled him so that he can.
Okay. Peter, are you there? There you are.
Looks like I at least can, I don't know about the camera, but.
Jeremy, you know Peter from over the ages. He worked with Walter 80 for a lot of years.
Yeah, I was a Walter 80 protege back in the early 80s.
So we got about 10 minutes left here. You want to dive in with a question?
Yeah, I might reframe the question a little bit. And what I put on there was precipitated by some of the early comments from the panelists.
And by the way, thanks for joining us, Peter. Peter's with NASA at the Goddard facility right in Maryland.
I'm struck with, you know, when you're talking about the history of the West, that there is a robust indigenous knowledge that still exists in the West, in the North, in Alaska. One can have deep conversations with traditional knowledge holders. And I think, you know, your work and that many others has benefited from that. And I'm wondering, you know, other than the Kuna Indians, perhaps in Panama, is there anything like in the Caribbean? Is there anything like the 10,000 year history of indigenous knowledge that exists in the West and in the North?
And that's a great question.
The tragedy of the Caribbean is the depopulation by measles, mumps, and whatever. You know, we think that the Caribbean was populated by several million people. It's possible Hispaniola had 1 million people.
Wow.
And you know, there's nobody left in Jamaica. There are no indigenous people left in half the places. And you bring up the Kuna. Well, actually, the Kuna are really funny. They are hopeless in the ocean. They lost a war with the Embera people. And so they got kicked out into marginal environments. And they are the worst people you ever seen in your life to actually do something efficiently in the ocean. So the Caribbean is a deep tragedy, the tragedy of slavery, the tragedy of the histories of country after country are just profoundly depressing, you know. But in the Pacific, there is that.
Right.
I mean, and I mean, the Hawaiians are actually a little bit arrogant about it and revisionist. Oh no, we never did anything bad, which is crap. But people in Palau, people in throughout the Mariana Islands, who have a pretty deep understanding of coral reefs and who are engaged. And so I would say they would be the analog to traditional knowledge in Alaska.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and in fact, there are people who are trying to bring indigenous knowledge of salmon, for example, into policy in Alaska. But the Caribbean is a tragic place in terms of its history and what people were left with after slavery ended, you know. It's a very sad story.
Okay, and on that sad note, thanks, Peter. And we got 5-minute warning here. We got to wrap this up eventually. I feared we could go on for 5 hours. Julie Clausen, you want to jump in and ask a question you got there? She's from our course. Hello, Julie. Are you there with us?
Julie, I just enabled you, so you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hello, Julie.
Let me try that one more time. Sorry about that, Julie. There we go.
Oh, okay, I'm here. Hopefully my connection is stable enough. So my question is, so as humans, we're pretty bad at making connections of past and present, cause and effect. And now people are growing up under such rapidly changing conditions, mainly due to climate change. So do you think as a society, we can grow to have a deeper understanding of shifting baselines? Or are we just doomed to dangerous stupidities?
That's a great question to wrap things up with. There you go. Thank you very much, Julie. So yeah, let's use that for the major final statement from both of you. Let's have Patty take a shot at that first, and then we'll give Jeremy the final word.
Well, a good thing about being an historian is that you know that human beings are a complete mess when it comes to predicting the future. So whenever you hear a human being say something that is very gloomy about the future, you can be doubtful about that, just as you can be very doubtful when a human being says, I think it's all going to work out very well. So gloom is just as doubtful. So I would say my inclinations are probably more to the gloomy side of it, I guess. But it seems like your point is a very good one, Julie, that nobody can take it for granted that, well, climate, we can just count on that. I mean, the poor souls in New Orleans who know they can't count on that. So maybe there is something that is much better than any course anybody is teaching at any university that says, don't take things for granted and keep constantly asking, where were we yesterday? Where were we 100 years before? And keep navigating in time, because that is the most peculiar aspect of human beings, is that we have our rather limited lifespan. And you'd think we would be the best ever creatures in the universe for thinking in time. And we are really bad. There's the moment in front of us, and there's a moment that just happened, and so on. So I'm thinking that maybe this is a time when people coming into this world will just be much more inclined to say, where are we in this greater passage of human beings coming and going on the earth? I don't know. Will their elders, will their damnable baby boomer elders get out of the way in time? I don't know. They're not damnable. I shouldn't have said that. I'm one of them myself. But it just seems like there's not as much intergenerational dynamism as we will need for this to come off. And again, I feel very, very fortunate. That's where I live my life, is with a bunch of people who are very recent. I've given up asking that. When I wrote this book, Legacy of Conquest, were any of you alive? No, they weren't. They just weren't. So,
okay. And so now for the final statement, as the sun is setting on the coast of Maine. And
yes, it is. I just realized it's getting very,
the lighting is changing, where you now look like Father Time speaking.
I actually,
final word, Jeremy.
Well, I would question whether climate change is all of a sudden the greatest threat, because there's something called a pandemic going on. And actually, I think that the pandemic is already having how well we'll deal with it, of course, I can't predict, but the pandemic is having a profound effect on people's attitudes, their sense of safety, that taking for granted, and look at how it's divided us. They're the people who have put their trust in science and have gone out and gotten vaccinated. And then there are the people who, for some moronic reason, perhaps having to do with our previous president, have decided that vaccination for mumps and measles was fine, but for COVID-19 it isn't. And it's splitting us apart, and not just in this country. But I think that things are happening very fast in a way that is deeply and profoundly unsettling, not just to older people, but more importantly to younger people. And I would take as an example, oh God, I'm going to blank on her name, that amazing young girl from Sweden.
Greta Thunberg.
Yes, who is just an extraordinary voice. And the way young people have gathered around her. And so the one thing I feel positive about is the deep involvement of young people. You know, back in the 70s when I taught at Johns Hopkins, the students were really engaged. Then in the 80s, Ronald Reagan told them it was okay to be greedy. And it was really depressing teaching for a while. That's why I moved to Panama. And towards the end of teaching, you know, before I retired, I began to get this feeling of real engagement, like when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s, that it was really coming back again. And I think that part of the driving force of that is this profound insecurity about rapid change. And I can't help but be hopeful in thinking that this is going to lead to some profound change, hopefully for the better.
Okay, and on that note, we have run out of time here, although I get the final word on this. This is something to you, Jeremy, to think about, which is back when we did our shifting baselines work over and over again, we gave presentations and high school teachers would come up and say, oh my God, shifting baselines, I got to teach this to all my kids. And they would go off and then they would report back, it didn't work. Young people don't understand shifting baselines. Old people are driven to the point of tears over this problem of shifting baselines. They have the context. We've now experienced the same thing in our narrative training. There's an age variable that's going on here that's not been studied and talked about enough. And I think there needs to be an awareness of how you teach young people, given these constraints. If they don't pick up shifting baselines, they don't pick up narrative. It's part of the whole curve there. Of time,
but they do pick up insecurity.
They do, yes. Which is
the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, no, exactly. So anyhow, that's a topic for us to keep working on in the future that will guide our next discussion when we'll do this again, probably someday. Not too far down the road. Thank you all very, very much. Thanks, Jen, for joining me.
Great to meet you, Patty. You're
both awesome.
I can visit you someday.
Everybody thoroughly enjoyed this, and we'll get it up posted tomorrow as a podcast on Apple and everywhere else, and we'll get that to you guys. So thank you all so very, very much, and that wraps it up. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.